Have you ever wondered what frightened censors more than monsters or aliens on 1960s television? Imagine a time when the smallest flicker of horror could trigger a national panic. Beneath the polished smiles of network TV, something darker was brewing. Stories too disturbing for prime time. Tonight, we are peeling back the curtain on 12 1960s TV scares that went too far, shocking executives and haunting audiences for decades. Number 12. The Twilight Zone. The monsters are due on Maple Street, 1960. When this Twilight Zone episode first aired, it was not the monsters that terrified people. It was the mirror it held up to society. The story unfolds on an ordinary suburban street where lights flicker, machines stop, paranoia spreads faster than the outage itself. Neighbors turn on each other, accusing friends of being aliens. Within minutes, calm suburbia descends into hysteria. The network expected mild science fiction entertainment. Instead, they got a biting social commentary on McCarthy-era fear and Cold War suspicion. CBS censors panicked when test screenings provoked real anxiety among viewers. Executives demanded changes to dialogue they feared might incite unrest, but creator Rod Serling refused. He believed the episode's message about how fear turns humans into their own monsters was too vital to silence. Behind the scenes, the studio debated shelving the episode. Some sponsors threatened withdrawal, calling it un-American. Serling stood firm, and his defiance paid off. The episode aired mostly intact, but with trimmed crowd violence and edited screams to soften the blow. Decades later, Maple Street remains a chilling metaphor for collective paranoia. What was once censored now feels prophetic. A televised nightmare reminding us that the real monsters are never from outer space. They are our neighbors when fear takes control. Number 11. Thriller, The Hungry Glass, 1961. Boris Karloff's Thriller was meant to compete with The Twilight Zone, but The Hungry Glass nearly ended that ambition. The story centered on a haunted house where mirrors trap the souls of the dead. As each reflection flickers, terror builds until one final horrific image, a corpse reaching from the glass. NBC's censors were furious. They claimed the episode's visuals were too morbid for television. In one notorious sequence, actress Joanna Moore's reflection ages into a decaying corpse, a practical effect so realistic that network executives reportedly stopped the screening midway. The broadcast version cut several seconds from that shot, along with Karloff's closing narration about the glass that never forgets. Behind the scenes, Karloff argued for keeping the horror intact. He felt the episode's tragedy. The idea that vanity and grief could consume a person's soul was essential. But advertisers did not share his passion. Beauty brands sponsoring the show protested its anti-glamour message, forcing last-minute script alterations. Even with edits, The Hungry Glass became a cult legend, circulating in bootleg copies that restored the missing sequences. Its quiet horror, the slow creep of obsession, and Karloff's poetic melancholy all turned it into one of television's most atmospheric ghost stories. What censors tried to bury ended up defining Thriller's eerie legacy forever. Number 10. The Outer Limits. The Architects of Fear, 1963. When The Outer Limits premiered, it promised intelligent science fiction, but The Architects of Fear delivered something else entirely: moral panic. The plot followed scientists who fake an alien invasion to unite humanity through fear. To make their plan convincing, one volunteer undergoes grotesque surgery to become the alien himself. ABC executives expected space drama, not existential horror. When actor Robert Culp's transformation was shown, his human form dissolving into a trembling, deformed creature, test audiences recoiled. Several scenes were immediately cut, including the moment his wife discovers his disfigured body and screams not in fear, but in sorrow. Censors demanded further edits, claiming the episode's political allegory about manipulating fear for unity might be interpreted as a critique of government propaganda during the Cold War. The production team fought back, arguing that censorship itself was the episode's real enemy. On broadcast night, the mutilation sequence was heavily cropped and the closing narration toned down to avoid anti-authority implications. Still, even in this muted form, The Architects of Fear stunned viewers. Its message that humanity's greatest horrors are self-made outlived the censorship that tried to silence it. Years later, when restored versions surfaced, critics hailed it as television's most intelligent warning against fear-mongering. The fear was not in the alien at all. It was in realizing how far we would go to justify our own nightmares. Number 9. Alfred Hitchcock presents The Sorcerer's Apprentice, 1962. When Alfred Hitchcock Presents aired its final season, audiences expected refined suspense, not raw horror. But The Sorcerer's Apprentice pushed network censors beyond their limit. The story followed a disturbed young man who believed he could resurrect the dead by sawing a woman in half. It was filmed in Hitchcock's signature style, slow, creeping, beautifully shot, until the finale arrived. In the final scene, the boy attempts to perform his resurrection trick on a woman who betrayed him. But the sequence went further than anyone expected. The camera lingered on her lifeless body as the saw blade stopped, her eyes open in glassy terror. NBC executives were horrified. They banned the episode outright, calling it grotesque and indecent for home viewing. It became one of the first TV episodes completely pulled before broadcast. Behind the scenes, Hitchcock was furious. He argued that no blood was shown, that the violence was implied, that audiences were smart enough to handle the suggestion, but NBC would not listen. Sponsors fled. The episode disappeared into the vault for nearly 3 decades. When cable television revived it in the 1980s, critics finally saw what the fuss was about. The missing episode was haunting not because of gore, but because of its psychological darkness. It showed obsession, twisting faith and innocence into something unholy. Today, it is studied as one of Hitchcock's boldest moments on television, proof that the master of suspense could terrify without showing a single drop of red. In the end, The Sorcerer's Apprentice became a legend whispered about more than watched. A story so powerful, it frightened not just viewers, but the very people paid to protect them from fear. Number 8. The Alfred Hitchcock Hour, An Unlocked Window, 1965. By the mid-60s, television had softened its tone. Sitcoms ruled the airwaves, and horror was fading. Then came An Unlocked Window, a claustrophobic thriller that reminded everyone how terrifying the small screen could be. The episode begins in a storm-battered mansion where 2 nurses care for a dying man. A serial killer is reported to be nearby targeting nurses. As thunder crashes and phone lines die, the women barricade themselves inside. But as the night unfolds, one of them may not be who she seems. When the twist hit, viewers were stunned. The killer was not an outsider, but one of the nurses disguised as a maniac preying on his own kind. The final reveal, where the false nurse removes her disguise, left the censors reeling. NBC executives called it depraved and demanded it be shortened for rebroadcasts. They feared that portraying gender disguise and psychological violence in a realistic setting would disturb family audiences. Director Joseph Newman fought to keep the integrity of the ending. He believed the terror lay in its inevitability, not its shock, but the network prevailed. Several reaction shots were cut, and Hitchcock's ending narration softened to avoid moral panic. Yet the episode's power endured. It won awards for direction and sound design, and decades later influenced horror classics like Halloween and When a Stranger Calls. What NBC saw as too disturbing became the blueprint for modern slasher storytelling. An Unlocked Window remains a chilling reminder that true horror does not need monsters or blood. It only needs an unlocked door and a single moment of misplaced trust. Number 7. One Step Beyond the Vision, 1959. Long before The X-Files or The Twilight Zone, there was One Step Beyond, a show that claimed to dramatize real unexplained events. But one episode, called The Vision, crossed a line that frightened even its producers. It told the story of a group of soldiers in France during World War I who experienced a mass vision of the Virgin Mary. According to history, those who saw the apparition survived a deadly attack days later. The episode recreated the event with eerie accuracy. Blinding lights filled the battlefield. Soldiers dropped to their knees in awe, and then silence. ABC censors intervened immediately. They feared accusations of blasphemy. Religious imagery was a delicate subject in 1959, and depicting divine miracles on primetime television was almost unheard of. Executives ordered cuts to every scene showing the shining figure. The director protested, saying it was the heart of the story. Without it, there was no meaning. Behind the scenes, the network scrambled to rewrite narration. Host John Newland was forced to replace direct references to faith with vague lines about higher powers. The final episode aired heavily edited, leaving audiences confused and critics unimpressed. Years later, researchers uncovered the original uncut film reels. They revealed that the vision had once been a haunting and reverent depiction of collective faith. Not a sensational gimmick, but a moment of awe. The censored version stripped it of power. The restored cut transformed its reputation. Today, the vision stands as one of television's earliest casualties of fear-based censorship, a story about belief silenced by those too afraid to believe, proof that sometimes what frightens people most is not the supernatural, but the possibility that it might be real. Number 6. Night Gallery, The Doll, 1971. Though technically from the early 70s, The Doll's production began in the late 60s as part of Rod Serling's darker follow-up to The Twilight Zone. NBC executives almost refused to air it. The story revolved around an aging British officer haunted by a cursed doll sent to him by a vengeful enemy. The doll's glass eyes seemed to move on their own. Its grin widened when no one looked. The network considered it too disturbing for television. One test audience screamed during the scene where the doll slowly turns its head toward the camera. Serling was fascinated by folklore and moral punishment, but the studio wanted suspense, not terror. They demanded changes to the doll's design, fearing children would be traumatized. The production crew toned it down slightly, yet even the milder version caused panic among parents who complained about nightmares. Behind the scenes, Serling argued that the doll was not a monster, but a metaphor for guilt. The soldier's sins in India had returned to destroy him. He believed that sanitizing horror robbed it of its moral backbone. NBC disagreed and cut nearly a minute from the ending, including the shot where the doll's expression changes as the hero dies. When the uncut version resurfaced in syndication decades later, critics hailed it as Serling's most terrifying parable. The creeping dread, the poetic justice, the sense that evil can be small yet unstoppable. What once scared censors into panic became a lesson in atmosphere and restraint. The doll proved that true horror lies not in blood, but in stillness, and in the things that never blink. Number 5. The Invaders episode Panic, 1967. The Invaders was already a tense series about aliens secretly infiltrating Earth, but one episode titled Panic sent both viewers and executives into a frenzy. The story followed a small town overtaken by fear when people begin suspecting each other of being alien imposters. The twist was devastating. None of the aliens ever appear. The humans themselves become the monsters. ABC was not ready for this level of darkness. Test audiences reported unease and nightmares. Some thought the episode mirrored real Cold War hysteria too closely. When local affiliates previewed it, they refused to broadcast it in full. ABC demanded that the final act be rewritten to end on hope. The writers refused. Their version ended with the town burning itself to ashes. Behind the scenes, director Sutton Rowley shot scenes with eerie handheld angles and harsh lighting to mirror paranoia. Executives thought it felt too real. The sound of sirens and human screams clashing was trimmed for broadcast. Nearly 5 minutes vanished, including the ending montage that showed government men covering up the destruction. When Panic finally aired, it was heavily edited and poorly promoted, but the uncut version leaked overseas, where it became a cult hit. Critics later praised its fearless message about mass hysteria and mob justice. What censors found unbearable, audiences found prophetic. Today, Panic is remembered as a mirror of human fear. It shows how terror spreads not from creatures beyond the stars, but from whispers across a neighborhood street. The episode that frightened censors most ended up predicting the paranoia of the entire decade that followed. Number 4. The Alfred Hitchcock Hour, Where the Woodbine Twinith, 1965. At first glance, Where the Woodbine Twinith looked like a harmless ghost story about a lonely child and her imaginary friend. But when NBC previewed it, executives saw something else, a psychological nightmare disguised as innocence. The story follows Eva, a young orphan sent to live with her strict aunt. Isolated and desperate for affection, Eva begins talking to an invisible girl named Numa. But as the story progresses, furniture moves on its own, toys whisper, and the house itself seems to watch her. The climax arrives when Numa finally appears, and Eva vanishes forever, leaving only her doll in the rocking chair. NBC censors were unsettled. They objected not to violence, but to suggestion the way the episode blurred imagination and possession. They demanded script changes to clarify that Numa was imaginary, not supernatural. But director James H. Brown refused, saying ambiguity was the horror. Behind the scenes, even crew members reported chills while shooting. Actress Margaret Leighton described feeling a presence in the set's creaking nursery. NBC ultimately cut reaction shots from the ending and softened the eerie child's laughter that closed the show. Despite censorship, where the Woodbine Twinith aired to massive praise and nightmares. Critics called it the scariest hour Hitchcock ever allowed on TV. What frightened censors most wasn't ghosts or death, it was the idea that innocence itself could harbor evil. Number 3. Boris Karloff's thriller Pigeons from Hell, 1961. When Pigeons from Hell first screened for NBC executives, silence filled the room. Then someone reportedly said, "We can't air that it feels cursed." Based on Robert E. Howard's short story, the episode follows two travelers who seek shelter in an abandoned southern mansion. By dawn, one is dead, his skull split open, and the other is hunted by something neither ghost nor human. What follows is a fever dream of bloodlines, witchcraft, and guilt, a haunted house story dripping with decay. The censors objected immediately. They said the episode's atmosphere was too intense for the average viewer. NBC ordered trims to scenes of the zombified sister rising from the shadows, claiming her half-rotted face would traumatize children. Director John Newland reluctantly agreed, but Karloff championed the uncut version, calling it Southern Gothic poetry. Even the broadcast version terrified audiences. Letters flooded NBC complaining that it should have aired with a warning. Critics, however, praised its artistry, the slow camera pans, the whisper of pigeons' wings, the sense that evil was both inherited and inescapable. Over time, Pigeons from Hell became legendary, restored in full, and hailed as one of the greatest horror stories ever televised. What censors once deemed too grotesque is now praised for its elegance. Proof that genuine fear does not need jump scares, only atmosphere, guilt, and a house that won't forget. Number 2. The Twilight Zone, The Masks, 1964. Rod Serling's The Masks was meant as a morality tale, but when CBS previewed it, they feared they'd created something too cruel for prime time. Set in a New Orleans mansion on Mardi Gras night, the story follows a dying patriarch who forces his greedy family to wear grotesque masks that reflect their inner ugliness. As the night drags on, their laughter turns to screams because when midnight comes, they cannot remove the masks. Their faces have become the monsters they truly are. Censors balked at the final reveal. They called the makeup revolting and the moral sadistic. Executives urged Serling to tone it down, suggesting a dream ending. He refused, saying the horror had to be permanent or the lesson meant nothing. Behind the scenes, actors reportedly struggled to breathe under the heavy latex masks, which added to their panicked performances. On broadcast night, some stations refused to air it before 10 p.m. The network braced for backlash and got it. Viewers were outraged, yet unable to look away. Decades later, The Masks became one of the most respected episodes in Twilight Zone history. Its imagery, the frozen grins, the twisted faces, is iconic. What frightened censors as grotesque became one of television's purest morality fables. A reminder that true horror is not what we wear, it's what we become. Number 1. The Twilight Zone, The Shelter, 1961. When The Shelter aired, it caused phone calls to pour into CBS within minutes. The premise was simple. A suburban dinner party turns to chaos when a radio broadcast warns of an impending nuclear strike. Neighbors rush home to build barricades. One man has a fallout shelter. The rest demand entry. What followed was one of television's most uncomfortable depictions of human selfishness. Friends turned to enemies. Civility vanished. At the climax, fists flew. A man pulled a gun on his own neighbors. When the all-clear sounded, the damage was done. The friendships were gone. Censors were horrified. The violence and desperation were too raw. They accused Serling of portraying Americans as cowards. Sponsors demanded that CBS issue a statement, clarifying that the story was fiction. Serling refused. He said it was the most realistic thing he had ever written. Behind-the-scenes tension was high. The cast filmed the breakdown scenes in near darkness with handheld cameras. Actors reportedly wept off set from exhaustion. Network executives feared backlash during the height of the Cold War, but the episode aired anyway. The next morning, newspapers debated its message. Was it a warning or a condemnation? Over time, The Shelter became one of the most respected and feared pieces of 1960s television. It exposed how fragile morality becomes under pressure, how quickly trust can collapse. What terrified censors then now feels prophetic. The Shelter remains the most haunting televised mirror of human fear. It proved that apocalypse does not need bombs, just panic, and people who stop seeing each other as human. Television, in the 1960s, was a battlefield between imagination and censorship. These stories prove that true horror does not come from monsters, but from reflection. Each banned or censored tale revealed what society feared most about itself. So which one do you think deserved its ban? Tell us below. Like, subscribe, and keep watching the shadows.